Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, panel. Thank you very much for letting me speak. As you say, Keith, we've had some fairly broad brush looks at what's going on in the low-carbon world. We've talked a little bit about politics, a bit of a sensitive issue the day before the general election, of course. I'm unashamedly going to dive right down into my little world of offshore wind. Well, not so little world, actually, of offshore wind. But before I do that, some of you may think that Dong Energy is some kind of Vietnamese currency trading house. Just to clarify, we're a Danish energy company. We're active in 4 markets. We have a big thermal power business in Denmark. We have a big utility business in Denmark. We're the biggest utility supplier of electricity and gas. E&P, we're big, and also, of course, offshore wind. We have about 6,500 employees. Just to get a sense of scale, our revenue last year was about £6.5 billion. Of which about 12% was from offshore wind. I sit in the offshore wind business. I am head of asset management. I look after our portfolio of operating offshore wind farms across UK, Germany and Denmark. And as some of you will see, have seen, we're also heading off across the pond to the US. So hopefully at some point I'll be able to add some American wind farms to my portfolio. We've invested around £4 or so billion in offshore wind in the UK to date, and we plan to spend between £5 and £7 billion more between now and the end of the decade. We've got over 2 gigawatts of capacity to build. So we are a big player. We've built about a third of the capacity in offshore wind that's been built anywhere in the world. In the UK, we produce enough electricity from our offshore wind farms for about 1.5 million homes. We employ about 650 people. And we're based all over the country, from London up to Aberdeen, and from Glasgow, no, sorry, we're not in Glasgow apart from today, but from Grimsby, sorry to confuse the two, across to Liverpool. No offence. It rains even more here than it does in Grimsby, I can assure you that, having spent a lot of time in both fine places. So I'm going to look back a little bit. The offshore wind industry has been very good at making promises. Since about 2010, when the round 3 sites were allocated, we've been making great promises to consumers, to governments, to the general population about what offshore wind is going to do. And 2 years ago, I was standing, not here, but on this podium in Aberdeen at All Energy, and I talked about what the offshore wind industry needed to do, and I thought it was only fair to come back after 2 years and say, have we actually done what we promised to do? I put this slide up. This is what we called, or what government calls, the Energy Trilemma: keeping the lights on, reducing carbon, and managing the costs, particularly the impact on consumer bills. But as I said last time I spoke, there is also a developer's trilemma: managing the impact of policy, getting costs down, and, as the Minister said, also driving jobs and UK economic benefit out of this new form of low-carbon energy that we're building out in the UK. So I thought it was only fair, as I say, to look back and say, what have we done? So we'll start with cost reduction. Cost reduction is a huge challenge. We know that offshore wind is one of the most expensive forms of electricity generation in the UK. I would point out, though, that it's only really been going for around about a decade. And if you look at the cost reduction that other technologies have achieved over the longer term, and also what offshore wind has already achieved, I think we are well on the way. We heard earlier about the offshore renewable energy catapult. They recently conducted a detailed investigation into cost reduction on behalf of the Offshore Wind Industry Council, which I co-chair together with the Energy Minister, Matthew Hancock, as of today, maybe not tomorrow, we'll see. And what they found is that costs have actually come down faster than we predicted as an industry. So we were promising to get costs down. We've actually moved faster than we promised. And already we've seen costs come down from £136 to £121 per megawatt hour. And those are for real wind farms. They're not promises. They're not wind farms that we haven't yet built. They're the ones that up to and including the wind farms that we built as an industry last year. So already we're seeing significant movement. And as the plot on the left of the chart shows, we're ahead of the curve that was set by us as an industry back at the beginning of this decade. So we are ahead. And I think, as Keith also mentioned, we've seen the proof of that in the most recent round of contract for difference awards for offshore wind. We've seen Scottish Power successfully coming in at around £119, £120 for their contract, and I'm not even going to try and pronounce the other mainstream project, NNG, as we call it, south of the border, come in at 115. So we've already seen significant and real-world progress in cost reduction. Looking forward, on the right of this plot, you can see how we're tracking all the different aspects that deliver cost reduction, and most of them are on track. So we think actually as an industry we will comfortably meet our promise of hitting £100 a megawatt hour for projects that are built in the early part of the next decade. We as a company, Dong Energy, have committed to €100. The way the exchange rate's going, that's getting more and more challenging. But we're not the only company that's made these commitments. We know Statoil has, we know Vattenfall has, and others as well. So we're seeing real competition in the sector, and that is driving costs down. But that hasn't come without some important policy background, and I'll come back to that. Secondly, what's actually happened on job creation, on UK benefit? This is just a map that shows some of the things that Dong Energy is doing and has helped catalyse, along with some of our competitors in the sector. We see, for example, in Hull, we've seen 1,000 direct jobs created through Siemens' Greenport Hull facility for turbines and blades. We've seen hundreds of jobs created on the Isle of Wight for Vestas' blade manufacturing. We've seen large amount of investment going into foundation manufacturing in the northeast. One thing you will notice on this map is that there's a lot south of the border, and one of the things that we would very much like to see is this economic benefit that is now starting to happen move north as well, and see the benefits of this sector come to Scotland and exploit the fantastic engineering and manufacturing capability that sits here, the legacy of decades of manufacturing in Scotland. But we are seeing real movement here. We need to see more, but there is progress. We are delivering on that. So we've seen good progress on costs, real-world progress on costs. We've seen real-world progress on UK content. What about policy? Well, the progress that you've seen and that the industry has been able to deliver has all been built on a sense of confidence that we know where we're going. We've heard reference already to electricity market reform. It was a long process, but it's delivered a workable product that is enabling us to invest. But the challenge for us as an industry is, where are we going after 2020? And I think if, as a country, we want to get the best out of this sector, if we want to see lower costs, less demand on consumers, we want to see more people working in this industry, manufacturing, thriving on the back of offshore wind, we need to see the next government taking some action. The first one is the timeline of auctions under the levy control framework, under the CFD model. At the moment, they come out year by year. We need to see a better roadmap for the industry, so we as players in the industry can understand where and when we want to bid for contracts with our projects as they come through consent. Fairly simple thing, and I very much urge the next government to do that quickly. Secondly, we have a levy control framework which sets the amount of money that's available for offshore wind and many other things in the low-carbon world. We only know what's happening up to 2021. We need clarity, and we need it soon for the post-2020 world, because for us, 5 years is gone, 6 years is gone in the twinkling of an eye. We're already working on the projects that we want to build post-2020, and at the moment, we have no idea what that world is going to look like in terms of what the government's ambitions are. And thirdly, we need to see a decarbonisation target. This will really set the trajectory, not just for our industry, but for the whole of the low-carbon world. Whether you're here to talk about wind, talk about heat, talk about transport, we know that with a decarbonisation target for 2030, set by government with advice from the Committee on Climate Change, we have an opportunity to set the trajectory which will give investors like Dong Energy the confidence to continue to put the billions of pounds into this sector that it urgently needs. As a developer, we do like to do things on schedule and under budget. So Keith, I think I've bought you some time back. I will stop there and give Ian a chance to have his 10 minutes of glory.
Good morning. Benji, it's 5.5 hours by train from Glasgow to Grimsby if you're a bit confused. You are quite some way away. Fergus, you were lucky. Only dealing with 4 UK energy ministers. In my time as CEO, I had to deal with 11. And of course, we have an election tomorrow. I don't know whether you've spotted it from the newspaper coverage, but apparently there's an election tomorrow. So I thought I'd play a little game. I have come up with a nightmare scenario for you. The nightmare is that you wake up on Friday morning and find that I am the new Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change. What would I do? Well, there are about 100 things that I would want to get cracking on, but I've got a list of 10 things that I would do. The first thing I would do is I would say to my civil servants, I want the absolute truth about security of supply for this coming winter, because that's the first thing that will lose me my job. And I want to know how much of our energy security is coming from our two interconnectors, because typically, over the course of last winter, 5% of the UK's electricity was coming through the Dutch and French interconnector. If there was a cold spell in Europe, we couldn't rely on that. Are we okay? Because there is still time to do something about it. That's the first one. And I don't want disappearance ratios and all that. I want the raw facts. So that's the first thing. If they're still listening to me at this stage, I'd tell them that I think the whole CFD edifice is a complete fiasco. But I would let the next auctions run. But I would want to do two things. I'd start the battle with Treasury before the Chancellor's opened his first red box on the levy control framework, which is frankly a disgrace. It is not democratic, it is not supervised by Parliament, and it is intellectually deficient. So I'd fight the battle with Treasury, but I'd also make sure that the auction design, which I'm stuffed with, is actually going to produce me some interesting data. Because frankly, bids for solar that are projects that never get built is useless. Then I've got the complete mess that is the energy supply industry. Because my predecessor, bear in mind this is for you, my predecessor decided to kick this into the long grass and ask the CMA what they thought. But whatever comes out of that will happen on my watch. And frankly, there are only two ways of solving this tangled mess. Either properly regulate it or strip away all the stupid interventions and go with competition and markets. One or the other. And I would say to my civil servants, they had 2 weeks to analyse those two options and recommend which one we should do. And then frankly, I'd flip a coin. Because either of them are better than where we are now. Then there's the question of onshore wind. It is the most affordable renewable technology at scale we have in the UK. 70% of people are in favour of it, and yet 80% of the media are against it. We have to win that battle, I would be telling my citizens. Get me the comms team in. I want to get on the front foot. What are the real issues? If it's about cumulative impact, there are technologies. I'm involved in a small company, which, by the way, on Friday, I've had to sell my shares because I've got to get rid of all my conflicts of interest. But today, I am an investor in Linknode, and they're looking at digital technology to look at cumulative impact. Stand J44, that's my advert over. But the real point here is we have to win this argument that onshore wind is a useful and valuable contribution to the energy trilemma. Then there's the nuclear CFD that fortunately still hasn't been signed. And it's now £100 a megawatt hour because the £92.50 is in about 4 years ago prices. So the first thing, next group of civil servants, how on earth can I renegotiate this contract? Because I ain't signing the one you've got on the table. Either get the price down or tear it up. They're certainly not talking to me now. I then get a different group of people and say, I've got a big intellectual problem here. We have two sets of policies that are intellectually and morally inconsistent. We want to maximise our fossil fuel recoveries, and we want to limit climate change to 2 degrees C. The world cannot do those two things. We have more unburnt carbon in the ground than we can safely burn globally. How do we resolve that conundrum in the UK? We cannot, I don't think in good conscience, assume that somebody else won't burn their carbon, which is what this quote from Hugh Kirk's. So what I want to do here is set up a Royal Commission to understand that tension. How do we transition from a fossil environment to a non-fossil environment? How do we transition employment? There are hundreds of thousands of people involved in oil and gas. How do we transition? So I want a Royal Commission, because this is important. I'm not going to rush this, but we have to address it head on. On this slide, I've got two things I want the team to do. They're related because the policy instruments are sort of broadly the same. Energy efficiency and heat. About 40% of the energy we use is heat. And we all waste energy. And yet our policy interventions around heat and energy efficiency are by far and away the weakest we have in the energy agenda. They're driven by political doctrine and dogma. I want to have a proper apolitical look at policy interventions that have worked in this country and that have worked elsewhere in energy efficiency and heat, because there are real prizes here. I also want an independent system operator. I think having National Grid having the system operation role as well as a transmission operating role for England and Wales is not the right model. We've also, as a consequence, got a proliferation of companies and bodies that are meant to keep everybody in order. Put this all into a strong, well-resourced, independent system operator owned by the industry, and not for loss company, owned by the industry, so no one person controls it, have public ownership in it as well, and it runs the system for the public good. So that's what I want to do. The final thing is, again, this is where I'm going to ask the civil servants to go off and think. Electricity, we need to decarbonise electricity quickly. Policy measures have been messy, generally short-term, and they're local, i.e. they're national. But electricity is unique. In the kilowatt hour is the same wherever you go. A kilowatt hour in America will charge your smartphone. It will in Australia. A gram of carbon emissions is the same wherever it's emitted. It causes the same impact on the environment. Why can't we take the fact that electricity and carbon are directly comparable in time and space and have a different approach? And I'm drawn here by Moore's law. Moore is the handsome guy on the screen. He's the guy who 50 years ago said that the power of semiconductors would double every 2 years. And it has, which is why you have in your pocket a more powerful computer than could have fitted in this room 50 years ago. So that's Moore's law. So what's Marchant's law? Marchant's law is that we should halve the carbon intensity of electricity generation every 10 years. In the UK, typically it's around 500 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. So in 10 years' time, it should be 250. In 20 years' time, it should be 125, and so on. Now, the advantage of that is you can do it at country level, at state level. This could be the basis of a global deal out of Paris, because every country could say, we'll do that, takes your starting point and applies proportionately equal pain. So it can be used cross-border. It can be set for the long term, goes beyond 2050. It can work alongside other policy instruments. It's technology neutral, and it lets government get out of construction decisions, which is the single biggest flaw of the whole EMR process. The government in this country, and now me, oh, I've got a lot of power here, because I can decide, because this is now Friday, I can decide who gets to build, what, where, when. So Benj, I have suddenly become the most important person in Benj's life. That's why he's gone white. And it allows nuclear, renewables and CCS to compete over the short, medium and long term. I am a big fan of renewables. That's why I'm here. But this mechanism forces our industry to get its act together, because we've got to be the low-cost solution to reducing the carbon intensity of electricity generation. If we're not, one of the other technologies come on. So the reason I like something like Marchant, it's simple. I am a simple person. I get it. It's measurable. It's comparable, and it could be a contribution to the energy policy debate. So this is the last thing that I kick off on day one in Whitehall Place. Where's my thought going on? Where's my strategy? I want you to think about this. Can this be an impact in Paris? Can we frame this for policy? So those are my 10 things that I would do. And it's about lunchtime on Friday by this stage. And you're probably thinking that you're living a nightmare. My fear is whoever we get, we will end up with another nightmare. Because over the last 11 years, or 12 years, we've had such a fragmented approach to energy that we haven't seen any coherence. We've seen more white papers issued than CCGTs built. We have seen, I happened to meet my first energy minister again yesterday, Brian Wilson. A number of you know Brian. And I think, Jim, you talked about Project Transmit. My first ever meeting as a CEO with my first energy minister with Brian Wilson was about Project Transmit 12 years ago. Nothing has happened. That's the recipe that we have and the road we're on, the energy nightmare that we're on. So maybe, to completely misquote Churchill, I'm the worst energy minister we've ever had, apart from anyone else we've ever tried. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to Ian. A fantastic way to end this session with a great bit of advice tomorrow, which is vote Ian, and we'll all be in a better place. Look, thank you for coming along to this opening session. I hope you found it very useful, very informative. I hope it sets you up for a great conference for the next 2 days. I'd encourage you just to take a look around yourself. How many conferences have you been to over the years and you're sitting in the conference hall and it's half empty? This is fantastic. This conference hall is full. That is a great tribute to the conference organisers, to all of you. It shows you the importance of this industry, even the day before a general election, and it shows you the attractiveness of the city of Glasgow, that we can get people here in such a successful way and for such a successful conference. Can I just please ask you to do one last thing before you get up and leave for coffee, which is to say another huge thanks to everyone on the panel. It's been fantastic. Thank you.